All right, so this is where we left off in the last part. So let's get started with making the back and the sides. So I'm going to go back into material preview mode here, and we actually already made the back when we made our duplicate of the top. So I'm going to unhide mine here. I just sort of had it hidden in the background, and I'm just going to drag it in the y-axis backwards a little bit. Now, because this is an exact duplicate of the top, we can actually join these two objects fairly easily. So I've dragged the back piece out a little bit. And one thing quickly before we go any further, I noticed earlier I made a small mistake when I made part of this face here, because although we have a loop cut going all the way around the outside of this object, I noticed that we have these triangles here in the corner. And we don't want tris in the mesh. Normally it's not a problem if you're working with a planar surface. It's fine to have tris, and if you're going to export for a game engine, then quad faces will get triangulated anyways. But it's better practice for us to not have them here. So what I'm going to do is, just to clean this up a little bit, I'm just going to add a loop cut here on the right and on the left, and actually, I'll just do it on the left, and then I'll just delete everything on the right, all those verts, and then add a mirror modifier just to make sure that it's exactly the same on either side, and turn on clipping, and just as we did before, just to make sure that is correct. Good. And then here, so I added a loop cut here on this right, so that's turned this tri up here and this tri down here on the bottom into quads, and then I'm just going to shape this a little more carefully by GG to drag this vert down, and GG to drag some of these up. And essentially what we're doing here is we're creating a topology which gives us another sort of edge flow around the outside here. And that's just a little bit cleaner. And so I'll make this correction on the back as well. All right, so I'll just do the same thing here on the bottom, and just try to make it look pretty tidy. And just another trick here to smooth out edge loops like this. If you alt-click, I'm just going to alt-click to select all portions of this, and then you hit GG to edge slide. If you hit E, it will align those edges to one side or the other, and if you hit E again, it will align it the other way. So now this is fairly straight and clean all the way around. Perfect. All right. So now I have unhidden this top piece here, and we're going to start working on the sides. Now, this would probably be a good time to get this into the correct scale. It's always a good idea to work in real-world scale for building photorealistic objects, because if the scale is off, things just won't look right. And sometimes if they're off even by like a pretty slim amount, they won't look right, and you won't really know why. Luckily for me, I have the schematics for a Gibson L00 right here, so this will be a pretty good approximation, even if it's a different guitar, not quite exact. So this one looks like it is 491 millimeters, I believe, in length. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift click both of them so that they're both highlighted, and then with N, open this panel here and click on item, and that's gonna tell us the dimensions. And actually, I'm gonna make sure I apply all transforms first, just so that the axes are correct and rotation and scale are applied. So I'll shift click both of these, and currently it is 797 millimeters, which is a little too large. So I'm gonna hit S to scale, and I'm just gonna watch that Z dimension as I scale it down until it gets around where I want. And if you hold shift while you're scaling, it will scale more slowly so that we can get exactly 491 millimeters, or 0.491 meters. And then I will click to set that as the scale, and that should be good. And then I'm actually going to apply rotation and scale on those objects again, just to make sure. Now, while I have this open, one of the things you'll actually notice as well about this is that if you look at most modern guitars, the back isn't actually straight. So there's an angle here, and not only is there an angle, but the back is actually a little bit rounded. And so if you want, really sort of photorealistic, correct accuracy on this object, then you want the back to be angled or radiused. So I actually measured this angle earlier to be about -3 degrees, and you could do the radius on the back as well. I think that does make it a little bit more complicated, and I don't know if it's necessary for something like this, but if you wanted to do that, it's not hard. You could grab some of these verts in the center here, and then press O to turn on proportional editing and set it to sphere. And I'm just going to grab a handful of these verts sort of vaguely in the center of the object, and then G and Y to drag. And this sphere that you see here is essentially the size of the proportional editing tool. So if I scroll in with the mouse, it'll affect fewer verts. If I scroll up, it'll affect more. So I'm going to select a couple that are a little bit lower here, and I'm going to keep it fairly large, so it's encompassing most of the verts here, and then I'm just going to drag it very slightly out this way. Not being super precise here, but that's okay. And then I'm gonna go back into object mode, and I'm going to go R -3, and that'll give us approximately that -3 degree slope on the back. It's not perfect. It's not exactly how it should be, but again, we're approximating here, and that's fine. So the next thing we need to do is to add some sides. So in order to do that, I'm going to click on this first one here, the top, and then the back, and then I'm going to hit Control J to join those two objects, and then go back into edit mode. And now, because these objects are joined together and they have the same number of verts on the outer ring, we can alt-click to select one, alt-click to select the other. So I'm selecting the outer edge, essentially, of both of those objects. So I have the outer edges on each of these two pieces selected, and then I'm going to go into search. By default, my search is space, but I think that does depend on your settings. So if you hit Edit Preferences, and then go to Input, Key Map, Spacebar Action here. I have it set to search. I think by default it might be set to play, but search is just way too useful to not have bound to that. So I'm going to search, and then I'm going to look for bridge edge loops. So we'll bridge edge loops, and that will fill in the rest of the geometry between those faces. All right. Now there is another thing that we should do, which is we should create a material for the sides and for the back. And link is in the description to the one that I'm going to use, but you can use any wood that you want. The reason that I'm going to use this one in particular is because it looks a lot like a type of rosewood that's commonly used on instruments. But I'm going to tweak it a little bit so that it looks a little bit closer. So let's do that. So very quickly, before we do that, one thing that you'll notice right away is that if we look at this from the side, we have a very noticeable rounded edge on the front, but not on the back. And the reason for that is because the subsurf modifier is being applied, but the normals are not essentially correct on this object. So if we go up here to this Show Overlays button and just click the drop down and hit Face Orientation, you'll see that on the inside of our object we have one of these blue faces, and on the outside we have a red face. And so that just indicates that the normals on this piece of the mesh here are flipped. So in order to fix this inverted normal here, this red face, we'll just hit Tab, A to select all, and Shift N to recalculate normals. And so now if we look at it from this side, we should have the same rounding on either end of the object, essentially. All right, so now let's start working on the backs and the sides. So now a couple of things quickly first. Depending on the way that you rounded the back of your object here, you might find that it's sort of raised up a little bit. And so if we just tab into edit mode and go to viewport shading and just make sure that we have X-ray mode turned on, which is Alt Z, and then go into vertex mode. I'm just gonna select this entire back and just hit GZ, turn off proportional edit with O, and GZ to drag this down so that this is once again lined up correctly with the front. And then let's add some binding to this before we do the back and the back and sides. So we have this binding material that we made earlier for the rosette. We can use the same one here to do the binding around the edge of the instrument. So I'm just going to hit Control R to add a loop cut all the way around the instrument here. And I'm just going to edge slide it all the way over here to the left. And then I'm going to do the same thing here for the back. And let me just slide that a little bit closer. And then the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add a loop cut behind each one as well. And the reason for that is just because I have another subsurf modifier to round this out applied here in this object properties here. But if we don't add a loop cut to sort of hold the geometry in place, what'll happen is the binding will spill over into the sides a little bit too far. And I can show you that actually here. If we go, I'm going to select in face mode, alt click to select this edge and this edge, and then go into material properties, select the binding material and hit assign. You can see it's spilling way over. And it's just because of that subsurf modifier. And so if we add a loop cut here and just drag it closer, it'll hold that geometry in place. And we can do the same thing here. We can do the same thing here on the top. There we go. And so now we have a binding that looks pretty correct. So let's do the same thing for the back. So I'll select this and this with Alt Shift click, and then assign the binding, and then we'll have that same spillover problem. And so I'll add a loop cut on the back and drag it close here to sort of hold that geometry in place. And there we go. So now our back and our sides have binding around them, and we have a pretty correct looking profile on the instrument. Now, one thing that I didn't check, which we should, is how thick this instrument should be. So we got the scale of the instrument to be 491 millimeters tall, which is correct. But I'm just going to double check what the width is at the widest point. It is 111 millimeters. So we'll do the same thing we did there. We'll just click this, and actually I think it is pretty close already. It's 120 millimeters. So I'm just gonna select it in object mode, hit S and Y, and then I'm gonna hold Shift while scrolling until we get this thickness to 111 millimeters, and then search, apply, rotation and scale. All right, so let's do the material for the sides. Now, in order to do that properly, we will have to UV unwrap the sides. So we had unwrapped the front. The back is not currently unwrapped, but that's fine. It's just because of the changes that I made to it after duplicating. So let's unwrap the sides and work on that first. So I'm going to hit Tab to enter edit mode, and I have the binding currently ending at this edge. So this inside edge is holding that geometry, but only this face loop here has the binding material applied to it. So this edge here is sort of where that ends. So I'm going to alt click to select that edge loop and hit Control E and mark seam. And the same thing on the back. So we have this edge here, which is where the binding ends. Control E and mark seam. And so now we can unwrap this separately from everything else. However, we do also have to cut this. So if you haven't watched my UV unwrapping video, there's lots of UV unwrapping videos out there on YouTube that can help explain this process, but essentially this is this face loop here that is defining the sides of the instruments is sort of like a cylinder, and so we need to slice it down the side here in order to allow it to unwrap and lay flat. And actually an easy way to visualize this is to, with this selected, if I Shift D, you can see that this is what we're trying to unwrap and lay flat. And so if we wanted to do that, we would have to cut it down one of these edges, and that would allow us to sort of unroll it. But I'm just going to delete that so we can do it here. So I'm going to mark this edge, and this little edge here. And you just want to make sure that it's going all the way through, that it's connecting both of the red seams here near the front and back. And then hit Control E and mark seam. And so now we should be able to unwrap that. So if I go into face mode, select this face loop and this face loop, and I'm just Alt-Shift clicking to add successive face loops. And I'm clicking on this edge here, Alt-Shift click, and I'll hit U to unwrap, and hit unwrap. And now you can see that it is unwrapping correctly. So it's getting this this whole thing sort of laid out flat. And if we go to the UV editing tab, we can see that that's the case up here. And it's not a perfect rectangle because, of course, our instrument is not flat because we have a rounded back. So parts of this will be wider and parts of it will be not so wide. So let's make the material for this. And we're going to use the same material actually for the back as well, because the back and sides of instruments are generally made out of the same material. So we're going to go into the shading tab here, and I'm going to make a new material, and I'm going to call it sides, and we'll use that sides material for the back as well. And it looks sort of okay like this currently, but this is this is spruce here on the side, so this is not gonna work for what we want. So again, the material that I'm using for this is in the description. You will have to use the 5.12 version if you do not have an account with textures.com, but that's fine. You can use that, and it'll work fine for what we're doing here. I'm going to load in the 1K version, so your values here for scale might be a little bit different than mine, but not too much. So I have three here. I have the albedo, the normal, and the roughness. I'm going to drag all three of these in, and it's this walnut veneer material. And again, link for that is in the description. So when you import these, I'm just dragging and dropping them from that folder into the shader editor. The roughness, you want to make sure that the roughness is set to non-color, and that the normal map is also set to non-color, and that the albedo map is set to sRGB. And that's because color maps are generally going to be set to sRGB, and anything that's just using essentially data that shouldn't be transformed with gamma is going to be a non-color map, so that'll be the roughness in the normal map. So next, I'm going to hit Shift-A to add a vector normal map, and I'm going to plug the color from the normal map texture in there, and then plug that into the normal slot in this material for the sides. And then the roughness, so we can just plug straight in, and the base color we can just plug straight in. And so then on our actual instrument, I'm going to tab into edit mode, and with those sides selected, and then with the material selected here in the material properties panel, I'm going to hit assign, and that's going to assign that material to that slot. Now the texture here is looking a little bit small. I'm going to select this top node here in the shader graph and hit Control T, and that will add in, as long as you have the node wrangler turned on, which was in the previous video, that will allow you to add this mapping vector pretty quickly and easily, but you can also just add them with Shift-A and look for a texture coordinate node and a mapping node. And then we're going to change the type to texture, and I'm going to plug this vector output into the vector inputs for each of these material slots, or each of these texture maps. There we go. And that's going to allow us to change the scale of this pretty easily. So I'm going to change the scale X and Y to 0.25, I think. It's looking about right to me. And if you're using a smaller texture, if you're using the 512 one, then these values might be 0.5 for you. And it should look pretty much the same as this. Now, the only other thing about this that I'm not liking so much is that it looks a little bit too bright. If you look at some references of old guitars, a lot of them are made of wood that has this sort of wavy spiderweb-like pattern on it. Especially really old guitars, like from the 50s and 60s, which is actually a wood called Brazilian rosewood, which is no longer legal to harvest because of over-harvesting. But these guitars are still out there, and a lot of more recent guitars use other types of rosewood, which are still able to be harvested. However, this is significantly brighter than that, and so it doesn't look quite right. Like this looks, if you look at this, it looks okay. There are some guitars that do look like this, but probably not an old Martin or Gibson, which is what our reference image was. And so I'm going to darken the sides a little bit and just change the color so it's more in line with what would be accurate for the type of guitar we're working on. So I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to go search, and I'm going to look for a hue saturation node, and we'll just drop that right in here between the albedo and the principled BSDF, and I'm going to change the value to 0.4 or probably 0.5 is okay. The hue I'm going to change to 0.45 or 0.47. That's a little too, maybe 0.475. It's a little too purple. And then I'm going to also boost up the contrast. So I'm going to drop in a bright contrast node here. And I set the contrast to like 1, and then I'm just going to hold Shift and drag the brightness up until it looks a little better. It's maybe a little too contrasty. Let's drop it down to like 0.5 and shift and drag this bright down till it looks about right. And maybe I'll turn the value down like a little bit darker, and maybe like 0.8 for the saturation. And that's looking pretty good. That's looking more in line with what I would want for something like this. The contrast maybe even could go a little bit lower, something like 0.3. I promise I'll stop playing with this at some point. Yeah, something like this is pretty good. So I set my hue to 0.47, 0.8 saturation, 0.35 value, and then my brightness to 0.12 and my contrast to 0.3. I may come back and play with it later, but that's looking pretty accurate towards the type of thing that I'm looking at. And just to show you a quick example so that you know what I'm talking about, this is something closer to what I had in mind. And it's fairly close. Mine might be a little bit darker, but there's natural variation in wood, so that's fine. The one thing I will add here as well is if you go down in the principled BSDF, just like we did for the top, I'm going to turn the clear coat up all the way to 1. That way we're getting this nice sheen on the outside of the guitar. All right, perfect. We're making some good progress. So now let's continue actually with unwrapping this. Because we still have the back to do, and then we can move on to some other parts of the instrument. So I'm gonna select this outer rim here, so on the outside of the binding, and I'm gonna mark a seam there, and then let's actually unwrap the whole thing at once here. So I'm gonna hit A, U to unwrap, and then unwrap, and you may find that this rotates the top just like it did the first time we unwrapped it, and it may also change the size and position of your sides a little bit. but that's fine. We're going to go to the shading tab and fix this. So the sides, just going to make these a little smaller, like 0.2, and then for the top, we're going to go to the UV editing tab, and we're just going to see what's going on here. Now I'm just going to turn off this button here that says UV sync selection. Sometimes that's a little annoying to have turned on. And with everything selected in this right viewport, this, you can see that this seam here is the binding, and so that's fine. This is the sides, and that's also fine, but we're not taking very good advantage of the UV space here, right? We've got these sides, which are huge. We've got this top, which is huge, or rather, which is quite small, and it's not really filling the space very efficiently. So what we can do is we can add another seam to divide these sides again, which I think is probably a good idea here. So I'm just going to divide this along the bottom, and this is totally fine because we're not really going to see the bottom, but also because the way that guitars are made, that is normally where the wood actually would have a seam anyways, so that will look fine. So we'll put a seam there, and then let's unwrap again and see if we're taking better advantage of the UV space. And we are a little bit, but not perfectly, so let's try and... So with all of these selected, so if you click here on the left-hand window, hit A to select all, and then search, and you're going to search for UV pack islands. And that's going to pack everything neatly in here like this. And hopefully that will be taking better advantage of the UV space. Now, because we've changed the scale of the UVs for this object, you may find that the size of the soundboard texture also needs to be adjusted. I just made mine a little bit smaller. I set my new values to 0.125, and that's looking pretty good. So let's make some bracing for this guitar. So I'm only going to make one brace for this, or two braces for this. Let's see. Let's actually have a look at our reference and see if we can spot any. All right, so what are the braces? So the braces are, if you look inside this, you can see there's this piece of wood that's inside the soundboard that's sort of stuck to the back. And essentially what that does is it holds the instrument together, because the metal strings can exert a significant amount of pressure on the instrument. And over time, that could potentially damage it. And so it's necessary for the top and the back to be braced to prevent it from sort of deforming over time under that pressure. So we don't need to do all of the bracing, but we should have one or two inside just so that it doesn't look wrong, because people who know instruments, when they look inside this, will know that something feels not quite right if they look at that and they don't see a brace through the sound hole. So we're going to add the braces. We're going to add one vertical brace down the back, and then we're going to add one horizontal brace as well. The other thing that I forgot to do, which we should do right now, is just to select the inside here. Select the back, and just make sure we're not selecting any of the binding here, and just assign that side material to the back. There we go. And now that looks right. Perfect. All right, so let's go ahead and make that binding. Now I checked my blueprint on the other screen, and the binding that is visible through the hole on this one is, let's see, 7 millimeters wide and 15 millimeters tall. So we're going to add a cube, and we're just going to scale it, and I'm just hitting S and G to drag it around, and I'm just going to scale it until it is 7 millimeters, so 0.007 meters. And then I'm going to scale this in the x-axis, so SX, until it is roughly as wide as the instrument, and maybe not quite that wide. That's probably fine. And it is also tapered, so the brace is not completely straight. It gets tapered in the middle, so I'm just gonna grab this top face and scale it in the y-axis. So I went into face mode, selected the face, and SY to to scale. And yes, screencast keys is still working for once. Perfect. All right. And these are generally also made out of the same material as the top, so we can just apply the soundboard material to it, and we can unwrap it. So what we can do here is just tab. Let's see, we should probably unwrap this properly. So I'm going to put a seam here and here and here. So I'm just selecting these three edges, Control E, mark seam, and then we'll do the same here, mark seam, and then we'll just connect these. And actually, I'm going to clear these seams, and I'm actually going to put them on the top. And the reason that I'm doing that is so that I can mark a seam here along the bottom. And now this shape will unwrap correctly without any visible seams on the top. Yes, so if I unwrap this, it's going to tell me that we need to apply the rotation and scale. And unwrap it again, and there we go. So that's now looking pretty good. So let's go ahead and drag this. Oops, I'm gonna hit 1 to go into front mode, G to drag, and put it roughly where it should be. We can go into the side mode and Alt Z to enter X-ray mode, and I'm just gonna rotate it 90 degrees this way. So R minus 90, and then I'm just gonna drag it in the y-axis until it's at the back here. And let's see how we're doing. Just gonna drag it a little further back. And that's probably pretty okay for now. If we need to touch it up later, we can. One thing I will note though is that because the back of this instrument is not straight, the back of the brace also can't be straight as well, otherwise there's going to be a shadow underneath it. So in order to fix this, what you can do is, just zooming in on it, I'm going to hit tab and add a bunch of loop cuts here. Maybe not that many, but a handful of loop cuts. And then tab again, and 3 to enter side view. And in vertex mode, I'm going to highlight the top. So it's selecting all of those top verts, and hit H to hide. So it's not going to stretch those. It's only going to, when we adjust this, it's only going to affect the ones that are not hidden. And I'm going to select the verts that are roughly in the middle here, turn on proportional editing with O, and then GY to drag this out. And may need to scroll a little bit until you get your, there we go, until you get your circle back in view. And I'm just gonna drag it like that until it's just slightly bent. And if you go into top view, it's a little bit easier to see what we're doing. It looks roughly like the same bend. And then Control L to select all of those. And then GY, oops, turn off proportional editing, and GY to just drag them back inside the instrument. And then before you exit edit mode, just hit Alt H to unhide all. And there we go. So this is now following the curvature of that back, and none of it is poking through on the back here. So we won't get any weird shadows underneath it. All right, and there should be one more brace underneath here, which is the vertical back brace, which is we're going to make out of another cube. We're going to scale it down, and G and X, and I'm just going to scale it in Z until it's, looks like it's tall enough, and then we're going to scale it in X until it is 22 millimeters wide, or 0.022 meters. So SX, and then I'm holding Shift to slowly scale down to 0.022 meters, and then 3 to go into side view mode, and we're going to scale this down in Y, so SY, and scale it down until this is about 2 millimeters thick. 1.5 millimeters thick probably is more accurate. All right, and then we can apply the rotation and scale. So click it, G to drag, and instead of dragging this one and just sort of randomly positioning it just so that it is perfectly centered, I'm going to make sure the origin is in the center of this object, which mine currently is, but if yours isn't, then in object mode, go into search and look for origin to geometry, and that'll put your origin in the center of your geometry. And then making sure that our cursor is in the world origin, which if yours is not, again, you can search for a cursor to world origin. And then I'm going to select this and hit Shift S, selection to cursor, keep offset. And it's going to put it right there in the center. And then we're going to go into side view and GY. And just like we did with the other one, let me just drag this in Z a little bit. All right, so again, in X-ray mode, we're going to select vaguely the center of this. I'm not gonna hide the front half of this one because it'll mess it up a little bit. So I'm just going to hit GY to drag the whole thing a little bit, and then also select all and just rotate just until it's looking kind of correct here. And you can adjust any of these a little more manually if you have to, but you just want to try and get it to roughly match the back of our instrument here. And then we're going to just GY to drag it into position. And if you find that any of these areas are still clipping through a little bit, just select them and turn your proportional editing up a little bit by scrolling, and then GY to just drag, GY to just drag those individual areas through just so nothing is clipping through. All right, and next we're going to apply our soundboard material to this as well, and we should also UV unwrap it. So the soundboard material is generally also the same thing that's going to be used for this brace. And I'm going to hit / so that we can just work on this. That's also a useful, if you're working on stuff that's where you have pieces inside of pieces and stuff, / will just focus in on the one that you have highlighted. And then if you hit it again, it'll bring everything else back. So I'm just going to click this and /, and then I'm going to select this and hit tab, and let's UV unwrap it. So I'm going to mark some seams just along that edge here, and along this one here, and then just alt click to select this whole edge and mark a seam there, and then A to select, all U to unwrap, and there we go. Now this should probably be rotated. This grain should probably be going the other direction. So I'm just going to go into the UV editing here, select all, and hit R90. And there we go. Now one other thing about this is that this should also be maybe a little bit rounded at the top. This is maybe going a little overkill with details here, but I'm just going to hit tab, and I'm going to select this top edge and GG to drag it inwards a bit. And the same thing with this one on the right. So I'm alt clicking to select that whole edge, GG, and just dragging it inwards a little bit. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Let's have a look at this in the rendered view, actually. So I'm going to do just a quick render here so we can see how things are looking. All right, so I think we're doing pretty good.